high-path asymmetric rates for the industry. This was in recognition of late entrants and the commencement of the Unified Service Licensing regime in order to create an enabling environment for healthy competition in the telecommunications market among the active players. To this end, the Commission commenced the process for the review of the subsisting 2009 glide path interconnection rates for voice services with an initial industry stakeholder forum in July 2012. Having gone through the rigorous process for industry statistical data collections, analysis and formulation into the cost models, the Commission is pleased to present to the industry the final draft report and filings of the consultants, PricewaterhouseCoopers of the UK. This final report on the interconnection cost model is the outcome of in-depth cost study of the data inputs received from the operators. The Commission, however, would like to express its displeasure by some of the big operators who were not very cooperative in the course of the collection of these data, and the consultants had to apply international benchmark figures to populate the cost models in those instances. The cost model results represent the figures of an efficient operator having taken into consideration the most appropriate industry average figures as provided by the operators in line with international best practice. The consultants PwC shall make PowerPoint slide presentations of their findings and detailed cost models, templates, specifying the various network elements that were considered during the exercise. This is therefore another opportunity for the industry to participate and provide comments to the Commission on the cost model results. I must state here that the intention here is to bring all the participants, all the staff of the various stakeholders that have knowledge about this, and that the stakeholders debate these issues, provide their inputs here, so that we do not have to delay any further in making a determination, having regard to the fact that we are already late in making this determination. So actually, the Commission would like the issues that will be tabled here before everybody to be debated there, and not, 2 months after people start writing in, I don't believe. So please, I have called, even this morning, I've called chief executives, almost all the important stakeholders here, that they should come or send their best people here to make their arguments, because this is the forum for that, and where everybody is present, so that the Commission can obtain their inputs and take consideration of them while making its determination. It's your active participation at this event and assures all stakeholders that your contributions, inputs, comments, and these results will be given due consideration towards the finalization of the new interconnection rate regime for the industry. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like to, at this point, just invite the lead consultant, to please present.
It's a pleasure to be here in Lagos today, and I'm going to take you through the study we have performed in round introduction, and then go through the methodology that we've adopted. It will be familiar to many of you. There may be a coffee break in between that. Just to put some names to faces, that's a younger version of myself on the top left. The hair has gone a little bit Michael Hart, who was the director of the project, you probably met here today. So just so you recognise who everybody is. But in terms of the context, I think we're all aware that interconnection and the cost of interconnection is an important determinant of cross-net pricing as it goes into markets, and Nigeria is no different. In 2009, and this year, or last year, 2012, we've been refreshing that study. The prices that were set were cost-based, but followed a glide. Today is look at the basis of the modelling in Nigeria at the moment. July 2012, with an initial workshop which was asked all operators to submit their own view and services they were providing and the underlying factor. On the back of that, the model was developed, taking into account the conditions and our preliminary results, airing your views based on this output. After today, the model with the actual data fully works, all the workings, the calculations and the mechanics of the model works. So I would like to thank you for the data that was provided and your contribution today. Let me talk a little bit about the methodology. Now, interconnection rates can be set in many ways, and indeed the history of setting interconnection rates in Nigeria reflected some of these mechanisms. They can be negotiated without regulatory oversight. This is uncommon these days because essentially operators do have a monopoly of termination of calls on their own networks, and that creates obvious incentives which can be managed. And hence we have a general process for regulation of interconnection rates. Based on the forward-looking incremental costs of providing termination services in Nigeria, but include the size of the network, the quantity of equipment and so forth, right through to unitisation of the cost of termination. But it is checked against the actual data of real operators in Nigeria to make sure that the results make sense. You will have the ability to do that yourself. Incremental costs. I think you'll all be aware that operating telecoms networks in anywhere in the world is a scale business. The more scale, the more utilisation of the equipment you can get, the more economies you can have through the system. And therefore, pure incremental costs don't give a full recovery of costs. Our approach here has to include a markup for those common costs of the provision of services. So there are no costs associated with interconnection or the network costs which are not dealt with in the model. The only costs which are excluded from the model are those which are uniquely associated with marketing, sales and the retailing activities of our customers, because we are talking about a wholesale termination service. As I touched on, there are different methods by which costs models can be developed. And this is a picture of practice across the world from a sample of countries and regulators. And these four charts essentially know how common different practices are. So under the cost standard box in the top left, what you see is that incremental costs is actually by far the most common method that's applied for the development of costs. That's incremental costs, usually including a contribution to common costs, which has some similarities with fully allocated costs. But this is the dominant and prevailing sort of model that has been adopted around the world, and we followed here in Nigeria. In terms of the model we're looking at, it's essentially a forward-looking model, and that is common as well, because this is an industry that's characterised by great change in terms of volume growth, take-up, new services, and technological change. So looking at the past does not give a good indication of the future. So here we're looking at what technologies can be applied in the future, but without a very extreme view of looking at the latest technologies. So it's planned technologies that are capable of being delivered. So the model, essentially, in the sense of GSM, for example, of cellular, is looking at 2G and UMTS services principally as methods. In the future, there will be LTE and other variants those are for the future. So this is a forward-looking view of the world as it is today, where individual termination rates associated with individual operators have given way to a symmetrical set of termination rates, and that process is something that's happened over time and continues to happen. And clearly, since 2009, there has been a bringing together of the termination rates of different operators. But there remains a significant application of asymmetries in termination rates to reflect those characteristics in the market, and we'll return to that. In the past, there have also been situations where regulators have included a premium on top of the cost of interconnection to reflect so-called network externalities. This is essentially the idea that there are benefits which can be funded from an interconnection to encourage more operators to join the network. That is something that is dissipating as a practice in the face of sort of other externality effects associated with calling, such as sort of flooding effects around on-net and off-net. So the general practice is not now to include a markup for any type of externality on top of the termination rates. And indeed, that's the practice that we follow here. Essentially, the total traffic increment of the network. It's a forward-looking view of the world. By that, I mean we're not taking into account just the historical costs of the network, but take all the future, having regard to the future demand. It's hybrid in the sense that we also test our bottom-up model against the actual performance and experience of operators in Nigeria. So we're going to show you later on some of the KPIs coming out of the model, and you'll be able to compare them to your own networks to get a sense of how realistic the generic model is of a model in Nigeria, of an operator in Nigeria. Specify individual models for individual operators or classes of operators. It's essentially a model that describes what an efficient operator in Nigeria dealing with real-world conditions of providing service in Nigeria will look like. We essentially model a single year, the sort of current year. So we don't try and model what it would look like in every year in the future. We look at the point in time and look at the sort of annual costs associated with that. And of scale and scope in telecoms networks, which means if you just set prices at the pure incremental costs, you wouldn't recover your total costs. And that's a situation we're not proposing here. So we have a markup to recover those common costs embedded into the system. So, just to give you the sort of key characteristics of that, we have a model that simulates a hypothetical network in Nigeria, but that network is indicative of the conceptually the competitive market operator that would set prices in a hypothetically competitive market. It's an engineering model. It's driven by demand and the geographical and demographic considerations of sort of Nigeria to build up the amount of equipment and the amount of sort of labour inputs that are required to run that network, providing a reasonable level of efficiency. I'm not talking about laboratory-style efficiencies. I'm talking about what it really is like providing a network in Nigeria, having regard to the availability of power, the requirement for generation on site, taking into account security and infrastructure considerations. So it's not some hypothetical view of efficiency. It's a view of what a reasonably efficient operator could do in Nigeria. Now, all costs are considered in variable to be in the long run, so no costs are considered to be sunk. So all the costs that would be required to build and operate a network and provide interconnection services are included in the model. Okay. And, as I said, all costs, including those common costs that are required to support the network and the wholesale interconnection services, are included as a markup on the interconnection costs. all costs, that is, apart from the retail marketing and customer care costs associated with acquiring and servicing customers, but not offering the network wholesale sites. So I hope that makes sense. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Carlos to dig into some of. As I said, the model will be provided to you probably next week to dig into at your own leisure.
Okay, thank you. So, in terms of the model, basically what we're going to do is we're going to see. So, at a high level, this is basically the network that we're going to model. So, we're going to basically model an access network, the transmission links, the DSNs, and once we model this, we're going to cost it, and then we're going to distribute the costs among the services. So, specifically, how does the model work? Basically, what we have is here we have our inputs, our calculations, and our results. So here we have all the information about demand based on the information that you provided. So information of demand of each service, how many minutes of incoming calls, outgoing calls, on-net calls, off-net calls, these kinds of things. The routing factors, so that's basically what tells us which pieces of equipment does each service use and how many times. We have then the network design parameters, which is basically all the technical information, the information about spectrum, the information about the transmission links that you use, how many sites are shared, what is the type of coverage that you provide, those kind of things. And demand. So each network element, what is going to be the demand that it faces? We then are going to start dimensioning our access network, both 2G and 3G. Based on the information that we get here, we're going to be able to dimension the core equipment that we're going to need for transmission. So how many links, how many backhaul links, how many core links, these kinds of things. This results here, coupled with the cost information, is going to allow us to come to an annualized network cost. And then we're going to then do the service costing, and we're going to come up to the results. So, for example, what do we do when, for example, to calculate the network element demand? So what we have is, we have all the call statistics, all the volumes of all kinds of services. We have the BCR statistics as well, so how is actually that demand distributed over time. And that allows us, coupled with the routing factors, allows us to have an idea of what's the demand that each network element faces. How many sites do you need to provide the coverage that you're currently providing? Then, what's the capacity that coverage provides you with? How much additional capacity you need to build on top of the coverage capacity to be able to convey the demand that you're facing? And then, based on that, you first start co-locating sites, so basically 1,800 sites out of 900 sites, which were for coverage. And then, if needed, you build capacity-only sites, so basically sites that are built just because you need additional capacity. All this is done at a regional level. So basically, we divide the country into different regions, and in the case, for example, of Lagos, we take it apart and we also analyze it independently. The inputs, yellow ones are the calculations, and these orange ones are the outputs. So we have the information on how many 900 sites we need, how many TRXs we need, how many cabinets we need, how many BSCs we're going to need. And here we're basically presenting for 2G, but the logic is more or less the same for 3G. Then, once we have that, we can actually start dimensioning the core network. So we also know how many switches we're going to need, what's going to be the trend. You come to an idea of how many MIDI gateways, how many switches, HLRs, these kinds of things. With that in mind, now that you have your entire access network and all your entire core network dimension, you can actually get an idea of what's the transmission that you're going to need. And this is based not only on how many links you need, but what's going to be the technology that you're going to use for each parameter, which is going to allow us to rate of the asset. These kinds of things. So, having said that, now let's move to the preliminary results. So first, just let's talk a bit about global trends. So what happens is that a lot of networks have modernized, you have more NGA core networks, you now have wider tree what has happened in the region in general. So here you have just a comparison to Tanzania to decrease over time. So now let's talk about what were the parameters that were used in the model. So firstly, these are kind of general parameters. So the PCR error length that we used was 0.026%. This is the information about how much traffic, the annual traffic happened, access-specific operational costs. So that means fuel, security, those kinds of things. The reason for that is that we're actually estimated separately as an average operational. What are the demand parameters that we use? Well, we're talking about around 7.3 billion on net minutes in 2011, going to about 10.2 billion minutes in share of voice calls that are going over the 3G network, which is 12. For SMS messages, we're talking about almost a billion SMS on net SMS messages. And importantly here in data, there's a significant increase expected in terms of data. So we're going from about 877 terabytes to about 3,700 terabytes. That's petabytes, if I'm not mistaken. So 2.7 petabytes. And of course, contrary to the case of voice, most of the data traffic is now switching towards the 3D network, where it's more efficient, where data traffic can be more efficiently conveyed. What is it in terms of regional statistics? Well, here we have the coverage. So in general, Nigeria has relatively good coverage in terms of area. Of course, 3D network is still mainly focused in kind of urban centers. So you have a lot of Lagos here, and also in Abuja, and these kinds of places. There's still not much coverage at the regional level. In terms of traffic, this is how the GSM traffic is shared. So this adds up to 100%. And so basically, what are the results that we're getting now once we feed all that information into the model? So we're talking about a network that has about 4,500 access sites. Of those, about 2,300 have power generators. We're talking about around 7,200 cabinets, about 50 BSCs, about 400 Node B cabinets, and about 2 RSCs. Because the traffic itself is conveyed now to the media gateway, because of course it's an NGN network. We mentioned NGN core network. So one SMSC platform, one mobile platform, one voicemail platform, even though that's not much used here in Nigeria, and 2 of each for the SCSN and the GSMs. So, as I was saying, what are kind of some of the ratios that we found? So, we're talking about around 1.63 cabinets per site. So that means that when you have a site that only has a 900 site, it's 1 cabinet. If it has 900 and 1800, it's 2 cabinets. So here basically what we're saying is that most, but not all sites have 2 cabinets. 5 are it's mainly at the core level, at the core network level. So that's kind of reflected in these results that we have. So we have a lot of 1,532 megabit links at the backhaul. So this is basically from the access network to the core network. And the rest are 8 megabit links in total fiber. And then we have the IP switches and the IP routers 11 and 6 respectively. Now, in terms of the calculation of the WAC, so this is just generally done with analyzing the rating of the Nigerian bond and comparing it to other bonds that are trading in the market, in the bond market. We have also information on long-term local and foreign inflation, because of course we're calculating a rate in foreign currency and we have to convert it to local currency. We have the asset beta, which basically captures information about the risk of the specific business, 30% in nominal naira. Pre-tax. And so, having got that done, so we have the cost, basically the cost of all the services, but this is the one we're interested in. So,
naira is the projected cost based on data for 2011, which was the starting point of this volumes and the evolution of the costs of the network. So what we see is that 5 points to from a minimum in nominal terms of 3.75, up a little bit to 3.93 in that period. Okay. Now, here we're really still talking about costs. Now, costs are the underpinnings of the setting of price, but it's not necessarily just a simple read cost. And one must recognise that there's a number of considerations that regulatory and policymaker will have in setting prices. The sort of current prices today is significantly higher than the estimate of costs. So the real question is, how do I move towards the costs, at what pace, and what considerations do I need to have about the introduction of shocks to the system? Because there are certain nominal costs upward. And that again is a consideration one should have, because it wouldn't necessarily be very sensible to reduce prices very close to the sort of costs just to have inflation and bring it back up again. So that's a consideration. Further consideration, and one of the principal logics of having a price control over an extended period, is just to give the market absolute visibility and clarity about what the costs of interconnection will be going forward through some years of their business plan. And that's very useful when you're planning your investment and thinking about your business and growth through the future. The different operators or different operators in different circumstances or classes of operators should be entitled to receive different termination rates. And remember, what I had on the previous slide is the cost of the hypothetically efficient average operator in Nigeria. January this year, the termination rate is 8.2 naira, and that compares to a cost of 5.2. Now, we look over the sort of future years. This is based on the sort of 1st of January of each year. One option is just to say, well, I've looked ahead to some point in the future when I estimate the cost. Logic of price controls have really sort of two major components. One is about providing certainty of the costs that different operators face in respect to interconnection, in this case, going forward. And the other one is that it has certain efficiency incentives. If you know that prices are declining, then you want to manage your costs to meet those. Now, clearly, in this case, there is still surplus left above the cost towards the price. And one should also think about what effect that has in terms of driving the efficiency notice of 2009. There was, right up until today, it's been, or until last year, there have been asymmetrical termination rates. And it is certainly true that the termination regulation is essentially what the regulator is doing. It's recognising that actually the termination market is not a competitive market. All the operators have a monopoly over termination on their network, to each of their customers, in fact. And the logic of regulation of termination is really to say, well, what would the termination rates be if this market was exposed to competitive pressures? And in that world, one would expect to have a single termination price. That being, in a typical market where you compete with other operators, the fact that your costs are here and theirs are there doesn't mean that you're allowed to recover. You're able to price to recover those. Effectively, the most efficient operators in the market will set the sort of clearing price of termination. And that's kind of the underlying logic. Be applied. Now, actually, they could be applied in many, many ways. They could be applied by giving different operators different glide paths. And actually, that's the most sort of higher asymmetric rate of about 8%, which is actually the sort of gap between the sort of the 8.8 and the 8.2 termination rate that we ended last year in terms of asymmetry. So that this is not sort of indicative of a particular view, but just to show you how it might work. Then felt that a period of, say, the next few years would be enough time for all asymmetries to be removed from the market and to get to a position where all termination rates may then be symmetrical going forward. And those are the sort of policy considerations that I think are important. So I would just like to conclude. I know it's been a it's been a fairly whirlwind tour through these, and there are a number of numbers and detail that we've presented. But I'd just like to thank all the stakeholders for their sort of contributions to the process from the point of view of the consultation, and I look forward to your sort of questions and offering some answers in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Alessa and Carlos, for that very detailed presentation of the outcome of the study.
Please hold. It's audible.
It's a good initiative, although it's not the first in Africa. There's a smart city in Egypt, in Cairo, New Cairo, which is a silicon initiative by the Egyptian government. And in South Africa, they have Gauteng, a project to collocate all their IT companies and subsidiaries. And in Nigeria, we're talking about that too. Silicon Lagoon in Lagos, trying to set up a hub. There is a good initiative for Kenya, though it's not the first. It's good that Africa is taking up the challenge set by Bangalore in India and the Silicon Valley in California.
When you say a technology hub, what exactly does it mean?
It means where you can get all companies, big, small, medium, that are into IT and IT services. You put them in a certain area where you give them free. Most of them do have free tax for the first 5 or 10 years. They have accommodation, they have electricity, permanent, it's easy access roads, and easy to get across without traffic jam and other things. So it's easy for you to say, this is where IT companies are, the taxes are low, the rents are low, let us go there and meet them. You don't need to go far to look for one company or the other, all of them are within that vicinity.
Okay, does that in any way, can we refer to our own computer village as a technology hub?
Computer village is not yet a technology hub. It's more of a sales and repair place. We still have a lot of the IT companies in Lagos. Most of them are in the island. Lagos Island, Victoria Island, some of them are in Lekki. So for now, computer village is not yet an IT hub.
Thank you.
The assumptions assume a scale and proportion that is far larger than what Vistafone has or what any CDMA operator will have. And so while, without attempting to critique the fantastic work that PwC has done, we are urging the NCC that while considering those numbers, which are basically qualitative analysis, that there are quantitative analysis, that there are qualitative measures that needed to be blended with by scale from the GSM operators. And we don't think that now or in the nearest future that there is a big chance that that scale gap, can be closed. So we speak in support of an asymmetric determination, where operators like us who are small and who have very little skill maintain a termination advantage. But rather than have a glide path termination regime like we have, we are proposing that it should be a permanent asymmetric regime where for the near future that CDMA operators are allowed to enjoy a slightly lower termination rate than GSM counterparts, because the skill capacity is so different that we don't think a hypothetical operator will represent a cost structure. Thank you very much.
Future competition in the marketplace, and getting it right is obviously incredibly important. Standing on existing protocols, I would also just say to Alistair to thank him and his team for what I know is always a difficult piece of work, getting this data together and deciding which approach to take. I know it's not easy, and I think you've opened up the debate in a very open way. Clearly, we at Etisalat believe that asymmetry is a critical element in order to maintain healthy competition in the marketplace going forward. When we looked at the hypothetical operator, that operator is actually it's bigger than ourselves. If we look at the scale, we have some 3,500 cell sites instead of, I think you had 4,500 there. But clearly that hypothetical operator is also considerably smaller than at least one significant operator in the marketplace, MTN, which is considerably larger than that size. So in order to maintain a healthy competition, it's clearly critical, we believe, for there to be asymmetry over the next 3 years. And we believe that the challenge really for the NCC is to decide what sort of form that asymmetry takes. Is it asymmetry with two variants, or is it asymmetry potentially with even 3 variants, as my previous speaker was talking about here on the CDMA side? The other point that I would make is that given the fact that the hypothetical operator is actually by no means the biggest operator in the marketplace today, I believe that to be so cautious as to have a long glide path is not necessary, quite frankly. I think the cost structure that you have going down to 3.9 is probably actually higher than the mobile terminating costs for the largest operator in the marketplace, and therefore I guess we would be encouraging the regulator to think of making a significant drop in the mobile terminating rate down to that sort of 5 naira per minute from the very outset for the largest operator or operators in the marketplace. We think it's very clear to us that smaller operators are competing at a significant disadvantage. And if I give you one example, even though Etisalat may be regarded as having been successful and having 15 million subscribers, in 2012, the reality is that in terms of operating profit, we had a smaller operating profit as a business than the imbalance in payments between ourselves and MTN. So we actually paid MTN more in terms of interconnect payments than we actually made ourselves as a business with 15 million subscribers. So it just gives you some idea of the scale of the challenge, but certainly one can only assume that that is even more significant. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You see all of the protocols observed. My name is Uche Ogunire, Chief Operating Officer for Interconnect Clearinghouse. You, or at least we were part of the presentation and the initial questionnaire. But we noticed in this case that you guys didn't put any options, any opportunities for traffic passing through clearinghouses. So as opposed to direct point-to-point interconnect or on-net traffic, there was nothing set aside for clearinghouses being part of that process. And while it may be felt that clearinghouses are not important for the bigger operators, there are a lot of other smaller operators who don't have the scale to build connectivity directly to all the big operators. So there's a lot of value in the work that clearinghouses provide. And so we're looking to see whether there was any consideration for the clearinghouses and for the traffic that will be going back and forth through with them. So I wanted to make sure that you guys can at least look at that and consider that for, I guess, discussion before the final review.
That we have not, similar events before now have not been given the scale, have not been upscaled as this. we've attended quite a number of interconnect international presentations, and it's quite good to see senior executives present here, and they rank the top right of the commission. That shows the importance and relevance this is accorded. Ethel identifies what is going on here. Our major area is in terms of the asymmetric. Mr. Evans was alluding, in essence, to there being 3 tiers in the market, really. You have a very large operator who is operating at a certain scale. Then you have a second set of operators, and then the third set of operators. The lines of asymmetrism that we see here reflected just 2, we see just 2 lines. And then we wonder how the aggregation will be done. So you have Airtel, you have MTN, Airtel, Glo, Etisalat, the CDMA operators, and you have 2 lines. Who will qualify for what? What criteria would you want to use to determine who falls into what? Earlier on, the criteria that was used in the previous determination was the time of entry to the market. Is that really relevant as today? You find some operators may have enjoyed, may have fallen into, benefited from asymmetrism at that time because of the entry to the market. Are the conditions, is the state of the operations today warrant, does the state of the operations today warrant for them to still qualify for asymmetrism, quote unquote? These are questions that need to be answered. In sum, we feel that the issue of asymmetrism should be looked at closely, very closely again. If it has to be, we are not in support of it because we feel that quite a number of, over time, for how long will you have this subsidy, quote unquote? But if it has to be, then our stand will be that you have 3 tiers. 3 tiers reflecting the dominant operator, yes, the dominant operator. Then you have the second smaller operators in the GSM niche. Then you can have a 3rd tier for the CDMA if you must go that route. And then also we noted in your work weighted average cost of capital. It's always been the area where you have issues around, and we did not see very much about the local environment. Particularly, there were some statements about factors to be considered, but when the figures were crunched, we did not see reference to the interest rate issues around here. We would like to rest our case at this point. Thank you.
EBC Act. Our standalone protocols. I would like to join my colleagues in commending the MCC for such a wonderful presentation and for an occasion such as this. I think this is the level of transparency we've seen in terms of the mechanisms used to develop this particular model is to be commended. I think it's something which is definitely something which will help advance this particular issue. In terms of the actual findings and so on, I think it's important that we be given time. I noticed the EBC said that he would like us to discuss it now. All our issues will be taken on board. But I think with the level of information that has been given and in terms of the level of data that was involved in actually compiling this, we need to see the actual model, the data used and so on. So I think for us at MTN, it's something which we need to evaluate. Also, with regards to the issue of asymmetry or not, it's easy to say, oh, the big operators, the big operators should be segregated, there should be a segregation in terms of size. But the underlying issue here is the cost. The cost across the board for all operators still remains the same. The same equipment, etc., particularly amongst the GSM operators. For us, though, taking this into account, I think we need to look at, in terms of the segregation, we need to be very careful how we segment. The level, apart from the issue of time of entry, another consideration for us would be the actual growth. What has been the level of growth? What has been the benefit of the last asymmetric regime on those who benefited? How have they grown? What's the level of growth they recorded? And I think that in itself should also be taken into account. Because the benefits you have today, I mean, if you benefited a lot, if the level of, I think I've touched on that point. But I think in terms of also evaluating the mechanism, the operating model, I think something which we want to look at very, very carefully. In terms of response, I think we would like to have time to review the model, to review what PwC has given, and then to revert to the FCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
As time on existing protocol, I have two questions. We need clarification on, you see, as of now, the rate, the custom was agreed based on the system. Now, for example, you say IN1, MSS1, something like that. But we have some regulatory projects which we must operate, and that change our technical network element. For example, the MNP definitely will affect the IN, the SPP, and HLR. The EOCN, head of call notification, will affect STP and SMSC. So I want to know whether all those new projects are considered in the future determination. That's one. The second one, in 2009, when we were determining the present rate, we all agreed that the asymmetric will fade out at the end of 2012. That's why we have 8 Naira 20 today, because we were looking at the time of entry. As at that time, Globacom was just about 5 years old or 6 years old. Now, those people who are asking for asymmetry today are as old as we were when we were.
GSM operators, we have a relatively new entrant into SAC, which has been very successful about growing positive EBIT, if small, but that's the nature of building a network. So the question is, what is the sort of projection for that?
What is going on here? Our major area is in terms of the asymmetric. Mr. Evans was alluding, in essence, to there being 3 tiers in the market, really. You have a very large operator who is operating at a certain scale. Then you have a second set of operators, and then the third set of operators. The lines of asymmetrism that we see here reflected just two, we see just 2 lines. And we wonder how the aggregation will be done. So you have Airtel, you have MTN, Airtel Glo, Etisalat, the CDMA operators, and you have 2 lines. Who will qualify for what? What criteria would you want to use to determine who falls into what? Earlier on, the criteria that was used in the previous determination was the time of entry to the market. Is that really relevant as today? You find some operators may have enjoyed, may have fallen benefited from asymmetrism at that time because of the entry into the market. Are the conditions, is the state of the operations to be warrant? Does the state of the operations to be warrant for them to still qualify for asymmetrism, quote unquote? These are questions that need to be answered. In sum, we feel that the issue of asymmetrism should be looked at closely, very closely again. If it has to be. We are not in support of it because we feel that quite a number of, over time, for how long will you have this subsidy, quote unquote? But if it has to be, then our stand will be that we have 3 tiers. 3 tiers reflecting the dominant operator, yes, the dominant operator. Then you have the second smaller operators in the GSM niche. Then you can have a 3rd tier for the CDN, if you must go that route. And then also we noted in your work weighted average cost of capital. It's always been the area where you have issues around, and we did not see very much about the local environment. Particularly, there were some statements about factors to be considered, but when the figures were crunched, we did not see reference to the interest rate issues around here. We would like to rest our case at this point. Thank you.
EBC and Astamino protocols. I would like to join my colleagues in commending the NCC for such a wonderful presentation and for an occasion such as this. I think this is the level of transparency we've seen in terms of the mechanisms used to develop this particular model is to be commended. I think it's something which is definitely something which will help advance this particular issue. In terms of the actual findings and so on, I think it's important that we be given time. I noticed the EBC said that he would like us to discuss it now. All our issues will be taken on board. But I think with the level of information that has been given and in terms of the level of data that was involved in actually compiling this, we need to see the actual model, the data used and so on. So I think for us at MTN, it's something which we need to evaluate. Also, with regards to the issue of asymmetry or not, it's easy to say, oh, the big operators, the big operators should be segregated, there should be a segregation in terms of size. But the underlying issue here is the cost. The cost across the board for all operators still remains the same. The same equipment, etc., particularly amongst the GSM operators. For us, though, taking this into account, I think we need to look at, in terms of the segregation, we need to be very careful how we segregate. The level, apart from the issue of time of entry, I think another consideration for us would be the actual growth. What has been the level of growth? What has been the benefit of the last asymmetric regime on those who benefited? How have they grown? What's the level of growth they recorded? And I think that in itself should also be taken into account. Because the benefits you have today, I mean, if you benefited a lot, the level of, I think I've touched on that point. But I think in terms of also evaluating the mechanism, the operating model, I think it's something which we want to look at very, very carefully. In terms of response, I think we would like to have time to review the model, to review what PwC has given, and then to revert to the NCC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I stand on all existing protocol. I have 2 questions. We need clarification on, as of now, the rate, the custom was agreed based on the system. Now, for example, you say IN1, MSS1, something like that. But we have some regulatory projects which we must operate. and that changed our technical network element. For example, the MNP definitely will affect the IN, the STP, and HLR. The EOCN, head of call notification, will affect STP and SMSC. So I want to know whether all those new projects are considered in the future data nation. That's one. The second one, in 2009, when we were determining the present rate, we all agreed that the asymmetric will fade out at the end of 2012. That's why we have 8 Naira 20 today. Because we were looking at the time of entry. As at that time, Globacom was just about 5 years old or 6 years old. Now, those people who are asking for asymmetry today are as old as we were when we were denied that asymmetric. So I don't know on what basis that asymmetric will now start again when the rate has come flat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raymond. I think we have taken quite a few comments here, and I'd like to listen to please.
Sort of linked to another consideration, potentially the sort of efficacy of growth of the prior regime. And the last question, I think, was really about how have you taken into account additional projects that have an impact on the network, like mobile number portability. Maybe I'll just begin on the sort of big issue amongst those probably, which is around asymmetry. It is what I tried to set out earlier on. It's very clear what we have looked at. We have looked at the costs of an efficient operator. In that operator, we have taken a view about the scale of the operators. So as was said, we have got a series of assumptions about what demand, what coverage, and by implication, what sort of radio access network grid is deployed and what the fill on that is. Now that means this hypothetical model of a hypothetical operator doesn't represent any one specific operator. We set in a competitive market for termination rates. And so I talked about that logic for the setting of termination rates and the counter considerations in terms of asymmetry, which is really about the impact and the benefits one might get in terms of dynamic efficiency effects on competition, of stimulating sort of different outcomes in respect to different classes of operators. But first let me sort of clarify a couple of things about scale. Now, it is absolutely true that scale is important in operators' economics. It isn't actually just a simple raw scale measure that is most important. So it's not the number of sites. The more number of sites you have doesn't mean you're cheaper. Actually, it's economies of traffic density that drive the real economics of throughput in the network. So in terms of the price of a minute across the network, what really matters is how well you fill your radio access network. Also true for the core network, but that's just a smaller part of the numbers. So an operator that has 4,000 base stations that run very hot is much more efficient than an operator that has 5,000 base stations that run 25% less hot. So, and this is an important consideration here, because one of the things that we've thought about in terms of the model and how to think about the cost of termination is also the requirements in the future in terms of coverage. Because as an additional cell site is added, the cell sites with the greatest expectation of high traffic density are the ones that get filled first. That's just the logic of going after the big rewards first. So the marginal cell site that is filled tends to dilute the average. It increases the average unit cost. There's this kind of effect as you go into the next area, you perhaps don't provide as much traffic on that cell site, and the average unit cost falls. So one shouldn't be thinking that just because one operator is measured in scale in one sense, it's automatically going to be the most efficient in terms of the unit costs compared to another one. So, in fact, you can look at markets and find that actually the operators that really manage to drive the most sort of productive, efficient data network are those that sort of concentrate in certain regions. Now you can see that sort of effect happening in Dar es Salaam, for example. So that's really just a comment on how you think about this. The other thing I would tell you is when you get the model, you can change all of these assumptions. You need to be careful to make sure they're coherent. So you can't just add more base stations, and you've got to think about the sort of traffic loads and all of those considerations as well. Now, when I talk about asymmetry, I think the debate is essentially this. The natural equilibrium of a telecoms market, there will be a certain number of operators that can survive in a sustainable sense, and that is the result of these economies of scale. This is not a market where you can have 1,000 operators, and that makes it most competitive, and that makes it an efficient way of running it. This is a market with scale, so there is a question about what the right number of operators is. Now, I don't think that anybody really has to answer that question. I think the availability, the opportunity for people to play in that market will ultimately resolve itself. And there is a consideration about when one considers stimulating sort of entry and growth of new players in the market, whether one is doing that beyond the level at which it becomes sustainable. So in theory, and I'm not picking any particular number, but if one had so many operators that actually the inevitable consequences of sustainable sets is really there ought to be some consolidation and merger. Introducing a level of asymmetry which prevents or tends to act against that happening actually may be in the long-term disbenefit of both the operators and the consumers in the marketplace. So that's the kind of consideration you need to have as well. I think it is definitely true that there are ranges, there are very different set of operators. You've got Vodafone probably as the largest CDMA operators. There are smaller CDMA operators out there as well. There are different levels of GSM operators. We have a relatively new entrant into SLAT, which has been very successful about growing positive EBIT, even if small. But that's the nature of building a network. So the question is,